This is part 3 of the North Central Texas Regional ITS Architecture Update Usage Seminar. Architecture Maintenance. In part 1 of this seminar, using the architecture was discussed. Part 2 covered project consistency with the architecture. This is part 3. The agenda for this part 3 of the usage seminar includes discussing the importance of architecture maintenance, the architecture maintenance process, and how changes are made in the architecture. The objectives of this part 3 are to understand the importance of architecture maintenance, to define who updates the architecture, to define the roles of the architecture owner and the stakeholders in identifying potential changes to the architecture, and to define what is maintained and when. It is important to maintain the regional architecture because it is a living document. It should reflect the current status of ITS in the region and not be a snapshot of some previous time, such as when it was last updated or when it was created. And stakeholders should be able to rely on its accuracy in their planning, programming, and implementation. The architecture should stay consistent with the region's other planning documents. It should not conflict with other plans, but complement them, such that plans in the architecture are also in other documents, and other planning documents, such as a long-range transportation plan, reflect projects that are also shown in the architecture. It is important to maintain the North Central Texas Regional ITS architecture because when it is not current, stakeholders do not have the information to properly plan, program, and implement ITS projects. This may result in redundancies, such as two agencies trying to develop a project that performs the same functions. Systems may not utilize all available information flows because they are not aware of the information flows available in the region. And agencies may deploy systems that cannot interoperate. An example might be two neighboring jurisdictions who each deploy a signal preemption system, but do not coordinate and are not aware of each other's plans, and develop systems that are not able to interoperate, so vehicles from one jurisdiction cannot do signal preemption in the other jurisdiction. There are many reasons the architecture may need to change. Some examples are when a project status or definition changes. For example, when a project was planned and is now implemented, it should be updated in the architecture to show that it is existing. Or its definition changes, meaning that the scope of the project or the stakeholders involved have changed and the project needs to be updated to reflect those changes. Devices, systems, or information flows are discontinued. The life cycle of a system or device may end, and that the information flows related to it need to be removed from the architecture to show they are no longer available. Or a system has, an agency has decided that a system is no longer providing the service needed and would choose to discontinue it, and the information flow would be discontinued in the architecture. The region's needs and priorities change. Major events may impact the region's plans and may impact their prioritization of needs, and that might result in reorganizing projects to reflect the new needs and priorities for the region. Funding opportunities arise and disappear. Projects may change their status or their priority based on the funding that is available. A project may become move up in priority when funding has become available, or may move down in priority when funding is not available. Other regional plans change. That means the plans of regions that neighbor the North Central Texas or overlap with it, such as the state of Texas. Their plans change, and changes in those plans impact the region, and those changes need to be reflected in the architecture. Stakeholders change name or responsibilities. This may be a stakeholder who changes its name or merges with another stakeholder, or perhaps changes their focus and adds responsibility or lets other agencies take over some of their existing responsibilities. Those need to be reflected in the architecture in changes in roles and responsibilities, and possibly in the devices that they maintain or operate. Other architectures are developed or changed. This means that other architectures in neighboring regions or at the statewide level are changed. Or it could be that the national architecture has been updated and there are new services and new flows that the region wants to take advantage of. And so it needs to update the architecture to reflect those new services and flows. The architecture maintenance roles and responsibilities for North Central Texas. The North Central Texas Council of Governments will own and maintain the North Central Texas Regional ITS architecture. It is important that the architecture is maintained by a single entity to ensure consistency and ensure that all changes are maintained and maintained by one agency so that they are not reflected in various ways in different versions of the architecture. The North Central Texas Council of Governments is ensuring that it has trained staff and the appropriate resources to maintain the ITS architecture for the region. And the North Central Texas Council of Governments is in a position that it is able to coordinate with all stakeholders in the region for the ITS architecture. The North Central Texas Council of Government will be supported by an architecture maintenance team. This team will be individuals beyond the North Central Texas Council of Government. They will represent transportation professionals from a wide range of services and stakeholders. They will meet periodically to evaluate requested architecture changes, and they will provide input on regional ITS activity, indicating plans and ITS deployments that are happening in the region. It should be noted, and will be discussed later, that stakeholders also have an opportunity to provide input on regional ITS activity. Stakeholders will provide that information about ITS activity through completing and submitting project consistency statements, through architecture change request forms, and through participation in regional planning activities. Part 2 discusses the project consistency statements. Later in this discussion, we will talk about the change request form. And participation in regional planning activities includes long-range transportation plan and other plans that will have ITS elements in them. There are 5 steps to the architecture maintenance process. Step 1 is identifying changes. Step 2 is evaluating those changes. Step 3 is approving those changes for inclusion in the architecture. Step 4 is updating the architecture baseline. And Step 5 is notifying stakeholders of changes. To identify changes, stakeholders can complete the architecture consistency statement for a project. In this, they may indicate where the current architecture does not reflect their plans by showing different flows, different elements, or different standards that might be applied to their project. Stakeholders can also identify changes by submitting a change request form. An example of a change request form is shown in the lower right of this slide. It is typically a one-page form that indicates what change is needed and the reason for that change. This request is submitted to the COG and the maintenance team for review. In addition, the COG and the maintenance team can identify changes in the review of plans and project documents. If they see plans and that are different than what is reflected in the architecture, they may initiate a change to the architecture based on what they've seen. Step 2 in the architecture maintenance process is evaluating changes. All requests for change are documented by the COG. They may come from a review they've done, through the architecture consistency statements, or through change request forms. Minor changes may be evaluated by the COG itself. Major changes to the architecture will be evaluated by the maintenance team. The next step is to approve changes or to reject changes. When a request is approved, that means that the architecture will be changed to reflect it. Minor changes may be made to the architecture by the COG after their review. They may be done at any time, and they are things such as changing the name of a stakeholder, changing minor information flows, changing the roles and responsibilities of a stakeholder if they don't have significant impact on the architecture overall. Major change requests will be approved by the COG and the maintenance team before the change is made in the architecture. These changes include items such as new projects, complete redefinitions of projects, the removal of a stakeholder, the addition of a stakeholder with new projects. The next step in the architecture maintenance process is to update the baseline. This means updating the architecture using the Turbo Architecture tool to reflect changes. The COG will have the Turbo Architecture tool and be able to make those types of changes. They also will do this to update the website and reflect those changes so that stakeholders can see what has changed. The baseline will be the underlying architecture that shows the existing ITS in the region. The final step in the architecture maintenance process is notifying stakeholders. In this, the COG and the maintenance team will inform the stakeholders of the changes in terms of the impacted services and stakeholders. It may be done through email notification. It can also be done through notification on the architecture website. When changes are made and notification is made, the COG can provide links to the changed information on the architecture website. The elements of the architecture that will be maintained include the stakeholders, their names, in case systems change ownership, such as one agency owns some devices but hands them over to another agency for ownership and maintenance, and participation in stakeholder groups, meaning groups of stakeholders who are functionally similar in the architecture. Roles and responsibilities will be maintained. Those are changes in a stakeholder's resources, whether they provide support to other agencies, and a change in mission for a stakeholder. ITS inventory is maintained in the architecture. New devices are added, existing devices are removed from service. The function of particular devices may also change. Project definitions and sequencing can be changed in the architecture. Scopes of projects are redefined, the priorities change, changing their sequencing, and their dependence on other projects may impact their schedule and impact their sequencing, such as one project that relies on an information flow from another project that has not yet been deployed may have its schedule changed if the first project's schedule changes. Agreements are maintained in the architecture. They may change when new agreements are created or existing agreements expire. Functional requirements are maintained in the architecture. They may change when the functionality required in the region changes or new systems provide new functions in the region, requiring the definition of new functional requirements. Interconnects and information flows are maintained in the architecture. New projects may create new information flows. Existing information may be exchanged between new or different systems. And existing information flows may be discontinued when devices go out of service or are stopped by an agency. ITS standards are also maintained in the architecture. Standards evolve and may be replaced. This is something that happens at the national level when an existing standard is superseded by a new standard created by the standards developing organizations. In some cases also, more than one standard is applicable for a single information flow, and an agency may choose one or another of those standards. And that might necessitate a change in the regional architecture. When is the architecture maintained? It is recommended that major updates to the architecture take place in coordination with the Long-Range Transportation Plan. This requires a broad range stakeholder engagement for the region, and it requires examining all elements of the architecture and performing a complete update of the entire architecture. Smaller updates to the architecture may occur in coordination with the TIP and other routine planning. This may include changes to the architecture by request. The maintenance team will meet regularly. The frequency of those meetings will be determined by the level of ITS activity in the region. If there are many ITS projects going on and many changes are happening, they may choose to meet more regularly. In times when things are more static, they may choose to meet less frequently. These are links to websites that are relevant to the North Central Texas Regional ITS architecture. The first is the North Central Texas Regional ITS website on the COGS website. The second is the National ITS Architecture website. The third is also on the National ITS Architecture website, and it is a page linking to free online training courses and other on-site training opportunities for ITS architecture. The last is the Federal Highway Administration's Regional Architecture Guidance, describing how to develop, use, and maintain a regional ITS architecture. For more questions or comments about the North Central Texas Regional ITS architecture, please contact Marion Thompson or Eric Quintana at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. This concludes Part 3 of the North Central Texas Regional ITS Architecture Update Usage Seminar.